Sweat dripped onto the polished tatami mat as the billionaire CEO, a ruthless third-degree black belt, locked eyes with the man holding the mop. She thought it would be an easy laugh, a quick sparring session to humiliate the quiet, exhausted single father, cleaning her elite private gym. What she didn't know was that the calloused hands gripping that fiberglass handle had once forged a legacy she could only dream of. In less than 3 minutes, the hierarchy of power would shatter forever. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, agonizing hum in the cavernous expanse of apex combatives. It was past midnight, and the rhythmic slosh of a heavy mop head hitting the industrial floor was the only sound echoing off the mirrored walls. Derian Phillips moved with a mechanical precision that suggested years of deep, ingrained discipline, though to anyone watching, he was merely the night janitor working a minimum wage shift. Derian was 34, though the deep lines etching the corners of his hazel eyes made him look a decade older. His faded blue uniform shirt, complete with a frayed patch that read "Facility Maintenance," hung loosely over a frame that was deceptively lean. He dipped the mop into the yellow bucket, wringing it out with hands wrapped in thick, calloused skin, hands that held secrets he had buried 6 years ago. His singular focus, the absolute center of his universe, was sitting in the employee break room just 30 feet away, behind a pane of frosted glass. Chloe, his 7-year-old daughter, was curled up on a battered pleather sofa, clutching a frayed stuffed rabbit and breathing through a pediatric nebulizer mask. The soft, rhythmic hissing of the machine was a constant reminder of why Derian swallowed his pride every single day. Chloe's severe chronic asthma and a string of autoimmune complications had left them buried under a mountain of medical debt. When his wife, Sarah, had passed away from a sudden aneurysm 3 years prior, Derian had abandoned everything he was to become exactly what Chloe needed: present, safe, and employed with decent health insurance.
"Hey, Phillips! You missed a spot! You absolute ghost!"
The harsh, barking voice belonged to Darnell Lawson, the general manager and head martial arts instructor of Apex Combatives. Darnell was a man who wore his insecurities as loudly as he wore his tight, moisture-wicking designer training gear. He was tall, heavily muscled, and possessed a jawline he constantly tilted upward to look down on others. Darnell prided himself on running the most exclusive, high-net-worth combat sports facility in the city, and he treated the support staff like stepping stones. Derian paused, resting his forearms against the mop handle. He didn't look up, keeping his gaze fixed on a faint scuff mark on the polished wood, adjacent to the main training mats. "I'll get it. Mr. Lawson, just finishing up the main aisle." "You'll get it right now," Darnell snapped, walking over and deliberately dragging his expensive, chalk-dusted grappling shoes right across the freshly cleaned section of the floor. "This facility is owned by Mitchell Enterprises. We cater to executives, politicians, and killers. We don't cater to laziness. If you can't push a bucket right, I'll find another charity case who can. And with your kid living in my break room half the week, you'd think you'd show a little more gratitude." A muscle feathered in Derian's jaw. The urge to pivot, drop his center of gravity, and sweep Darnell's lead leg out from under him was a ghost of a reflex, a phantom limb of his past life. It would take less than 2 seconds to render the arrogant manager completely unconscious. But 2 seconds of satisfaction would cost him Chloe's health insurance. Derian exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain through the soles of his worn-out sneakers. He forced his shoulders to slump, playing the part of the broken, subservient laborer. "Understood, Mr. Lawson. I'll remop the entrance. I apologize," Darnell scoffed, crossing his arms and admiring his own reflection in the wall-length mirrors. "Make sure you do. The boss is coming in tonight. She's had a rough quarter and needs to blow off some steam on the mats. If she sees a speck of dust, it's your job. And, Phillips? Yes? Keep the kid quiet. If I hear that asthma machine rattling while Samantha is training, you're both out on the street. Derian gripped the mop handle until his knuckles turned white, but he simply nodded. She'll be quiet. As Darnell strutted back toward the executive locker rooms, Derian went back to work. He moved seamlessly, his footwork silently mirroring the intricate footwork of high-level judo and kickboxing. He stepped off his center line, dragging the mop in perfect, sweeping arcs, transferring his weight from his hips rather than his shoulders. It was a beautiful, tragic dance of a warrior confined to a yellow plastic bucket. He glanced toward the break room window. Chloe was waving at him weakly. Derian offered a gentle, reassuring smile, pushing down the roaring fire in his chest. He was a father first. Everything else was dead. 3 miles away, the skyline of the city was dominated by a sleek, glass and steel monolith bearing the Mitchell Enterprises logo. Inside the penthouse boardroom, Samantha Mitchell was currently dissecting 3 venture capitalists with the cold, surgical precision of a seasoned predator. At 32, Samantha was an anomaly. She had inherited a crumbling tech empire from her late father, and through sheer force of will, ruthless acquisitions, and a terrifying intellect, had transformed it into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. She was stunningly beautiful, with sharp, aristocratic features, piercing, icy blue eyes, and dark hair pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense braid. But her beauty was often overshadowed by her intensely intimidating aura. "The merger is dead," Samantha said, her voice dropping into a low register that demanded absolute silence in the room. She tossed a thick portfolio onto the mahogany table. "You overvalued their assets by 40%, hid their supply chain liabilities in offshore subsidiaries, and expected me to sign a blank check because Mitchell Global supposedly needs a PR win. We are done here. Get out of my building." The lead investor, a red-faced man in his 50s, stood up, sputtering. "Samantha, listen to reason. The board is already anxious about your aggressive posture." "The board answers to me!" Samantha cut him off, standing up. She was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that somehow looked like armor. "And if you call me Samantha again instead of Ms. Mitchell, I won't just kill this deal. I will short your entire firm into bankruptcy by Friday. Security will show you out." As the men scrambled to collect their briefcases and flee, Samantha turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city lights. Her heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding her system. The corporate world was a battlefield. But the victories always felt hollow, abstract. She needed something tangible. She needed to feel impact. "Cancel my morning meetings," Samantha ordered her assistant, who was hovering nervously by the door. "I'm going to the gym. Call Darnell. Tell him to have his best sparring partner taped up and ready on the mats in 20 minutes. Full contact. Right away. Miss Mitchell." 25 minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the private rear entrance of Apex Combatives. Samantha stepped out, already shedding her suit jacket. By the time she reached the private executive locker room, her mind was entirely shifted from profit margins to combat mechanics. Martial arts wasn't just a hobby for Samantha. It was an obsession. She held a 3rd-degree black belt in Taekwondo and a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. She trained with Olympic coaches, hired private combat specialists, and treated sparring like a violent chess match. She was fast, flexible, and vicious. But she was also accustomed to people letting her win. Her wealth insulated her from the hardest truths of the mat. She stepped out into the main training area, wearing a black rash guard and grappling shorts, her hands already meticulously wrapped in white tape. Darnell was waiting, practically vibrating with eager sycophancy. "Ms. Mitchell, everything is perfect. The mats are fresh. The temperature is set to exactly 68 degrees. And I have Brad ready for you. Darnell gushed, gesturing to a muscular 22-year-old amateur MMA fighter bouncing on his toes near the center of the tatami. Hey, save the pitch! Darnell! Let's go! Samantha snapped, sliding her mouthguard in. Over by the heavy bags, Derian was quietly wiping down the chains, keeping his head down and his presence minimal. But his eyes, sharp and analytical, flicked toward the center mat. The sparring match began. Brad was clearly holding back, throwing, looping, predictable punches, terrified of actually injuring the billionaire who funded the gym. Samantha, however, was fighting with genuine malice. She slipped a lazy jab, pivoted hard, and delivered a devastating roundhouse kick to Brad's ribs. The crack echoed through the gym. Brad gasped, stumbling backward. Samantha didn't let up. She pressed forward, throwing a flurry of aggressive elbows and knees. But in her anger, she was sloppy. She was overcommitting to her right cross, completely abandoning her defensive posture on her left side, leaving her chin exposed and her weight entirely off balance. From the shadows near the heavy bags, Derian stopped wiping the chains. Without thinking, a soft, involuntary sigh escaped his lips, followed by a very subtle, dismissive shake of his head. It was the reaction of a master watching a novice make a fatal error. Samantha, stepping back to let Brad catch his breath, caught the movement in the vast wall of mirrors. She froze. Her icy blue eyes locked onto the reflection of the janitor in the corner. She turned around slowly, her chest heaving, sweat dripping from her brow. "You," Samantha said, her voice echoing in the quiet gym. "The guy with the rag." Derian stiffened. He kept his eyes on the floor, immediately going back to wiping the steel chain. "Yes, ma'am. Apologies. I'll move to the other side." "Stop," Samantha commanded, walking off the mat toward him. Darnell immediately scrambled behind her like an anxious puppy. "Ms. Mitchell, please, ignore him. He's just the overnight cleaner. Phillips, I told you to stay out of sight," Darnell hissed. Samantha ignored Darnell, stopping 3 feet away from Derian. She studied him, the cheap uniform, the subservient posture. Yet, there was something irritatingly steady about his breathing. "You shook your head when I threw that last combination. You sighed and shook your head. I was just clearing my throat, ma'am." Derian lied smoothly, his voice flat and deferential. "Dust from the rafters." "Don't lie to me." Samantha's eyes narrowed. The stress of the failed merger, the adrenaline of the fight, and her sheer, unchecked ego coalesced into a sharp spike of anger. She hated being patronized, even by a janitor. You saw something. You thought my technique was flawed." "Ms. Mitchell, he doesn't know anything," Darnell interjected, stepping between them. "He's a nobody. He cleans toilets." "I said quiet. Darnell," Samantha barked, never breaking her gaze from Derian. "Look at me when I speak to you." Slowly, Derian raised his head. For a fraction of a second, Samantha felt a strange jolt. The man's eyes weren't the frightened, hollow eyes of a subservient laborer. They were calm, deep, dark, and utterly devoid of fear. It unsettled her profoundly. "I don't know anything about fighting, ma'am," Derian said softly. "I'm just a janitor. You looked very impressive." It was the tone. It was too polite, too measured. It felt like a parent humoring a toddler. Samantha's pride, already inflamed by her boardroom battles, flared violently. "Impressive, is that what you think?" Samantha scoffed, ripping the Velcro straps of her sparring gloves off and tossing them onto the floor. "I think you're arrogant. I think you watch us train every night and harbor some pathetic, macho delusion that you could do better. I have no delusions, Ms. Mitchell, Derian said, picking up his spray bottle. If you'll excuse me, I need to finish the locker rooms before my shift ends. I'm not dismissing you, Samantha snapped, stepping directly into his path. She pointed toward the center mat, where Brad was still clutching his bruised ribs. I'm bored with Brad. He's pulling his punches because he's afraid of his paycheck. But you? You clearly have opinions. Step on the mat. Derian froze. A heavy, dangerous silence descended over the gym. Darnell laughed nervously, a high-pitched, grating sound. Ms. Mitchell, that's absurd. He's a liability risk. He's not cleared to spar. He has no insurance. And frankly, you'd break him in half. That's exactly what I intend to do, Samantha said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She looked Derian up and down, taking in the faded uniform. What's your name? Mop boy. Derian Phillips. Well, Derian Phillips. I want a real workout, and I want to see if your reflexes match your attitude. 3 minutes on the mat with me, for fun. Derian looked at her, his expression carefully blank. Inside, his mind was racing. He calculated the distance, the angles, the absolute absurdity of the situation. I decline, ma'am. I am on the clock, and I have a daughter waiting for me in the break room. I am not a fighter. Samantha crossed her arms, her competitive nature mutating into sheer tyranny. You are on the clock for my company. You work in my building. If I tell you to jump, you ask how high. If I tell you to spar, you tape your hands. Ms. Mitchell, with all due respect, I cannot. Derian took a step back, turning his body slightly to ensure he wasn't perceived as a threat. I need this job. I don't want any trouble. You already have trouble, Darnell snarled, stepping forward and shoving Derian in the shoulder. Derian's body absorbed the push like a stone absorbing a ripple of water, barely swaying an inch. Darnell frowned, briefly confused by the sheer density of the man. You offended the owner. You're fired. Phillips, pack up your sick kid and get out of my gym. Derian's heart dropped. Fired. The word rang in his ears like a gunshot. The medical insurance. The upcoming specialist appointment for Chloe's lungs. The overdue rent. A wave of cold panic washed over him, quickly followed by a terrifying, deeply buried rage. Wait! Samantha raised a hand, stopping Darnell. She saw the flash of panic in Derian's eyes and knew she had the leverage. She was a master of exploiting weakness. I'll make you a deal, Derian. You step on that mat right now. 3 minutes. If you can survive 3 minutes without tapping out or getting knocked out, I won't just let you keep your job. I will personally write you a check for $50,000. Darnell gasped. 50 grand? Ms. Mitchell, you can't be serious. I am entirely serious, Samantha said, her eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. But if you refuse to spar, Darnell is right. You're fired. Tonight. No severance. No recommendations. You and your daughter can walk out into the rain. Derian looked past Samantha, his eyes drifting to the frosted glass of the break room. He could barely make out the small silhouette of Chloe, still sitting on the couch, her little shoulders rising and falling rhythmically with the nebulizer. $50,000. It was enough to pay off the medical debt completely. It was enough to buy them a year of breathing room, maybe even afford the experimental treatment the doctors had recommended. But stepping on the mat meant waking up the ghost. It meant accessing the violent, hyper-lethal parts of himself he had sworn to bury the day his wife died. 50,000, Derian repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Guaranteed. I'm a billionaire. Derian. 50,000 is what I spend on a Tuesday. Samantha mocked. You survive 3 minutes. The money is yours, but I promise you, you won't survive 30 seconds. Derian closed his eyes. He took a long, slow breath through his nose, expanding his diaphragm, feeling the air fill his lungs. When he opened his eyes, the subservient, tired janitor was gone. The shift was so subtle, yet so profound, that the ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop. Okay, Derian said simply. He reached down to his waist and unclipped his heavy janitor's utility belt, letting it drop to the floor with a loud clatter. Darnell snorted, crossing his arms, fully expecting a comedy show. Derian began unbuttoning his faded blue uniform shirt. As the fabric fell away, Samantha's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Beneath the baggy uniform, Derian was wearing a tight, sweat-stained gray t-shirt. It clung to a torso that looked as if it were carved out of absolute granite. Thick, corded muscles wrapped around his shoulders and arms, densely packed and highly functional. A jagged, faded scar ran diagonally across his left collarbone. He wasn't bodybuilder huge. He was built like a coiled spring, radiating a terrifying, kinetic density. Derian kicked off his worn-out sneakers and peeled off his socks. He stepped onto the tatami mat. Samantha watched him, a sudden flicker of doubt crossing her mind. She noticed the way he walked. It wasn't the heavy, heel-striking walk of a normal person. He glided, his weight perfectly distributed on the balls of his feet, his center of gravity flawlessly balanced. When his bare feet touched the mat, his toes naturally splayed and gripped the texture. It was the stance of someone who had spent 10,000 hours barefoot on canvas and foam. "Do you need gloves?" Samantha asked, her tone slightly less mocking than before. "No," Derian replied. His voice was no longer flat. It was calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. Darnell jogged over to the wall timer, punching in the digits. "All right, mop boy. You asked for it. 3 minutes on the clock. Submission, knockout, or time limit. No strikes to the back of the head. Are you ready?" Samantha assumed her fighting stance, a textbook, wide taekwondo stance, hands up, bladed profile, ready to launch a barrage of rapid-fire kicks. She bounced lightly, vibrating with kinetic energy. Derian did not take a traditional stance. He simply stood there, his feet shoulder-width apart, his arms hanging loosely by his sides. His chin was slightly tucked. His eyes locked dead center on Samantha's sternum, reading her entire body's telemetry at once. He looked completely relaxed. Too relaxed. "You're not going to put your hands up?" Samantha sneered, though the uneasy feeling in her gut was intensifying. "I'm ready," Derian said softly. Darnell raised his hand. "Fight!" The digital buzzer blared through the gym. Samantha exploded forward. She was incredibly fast, a blur of motion. She launched a devastating spinning back kick aimed directly at Derian's ribs, intending to end the fight in the first 5 seconds and break the arrogant stillness he was projecting. The technique was flawless, the power immense, honed by years of elite coaching. But as her heel carved through the air, heading toward its target, a shocking realization struck her. Derian wasn't there anymore. He hadn't scrambled away or flinched. He had stepped inside her guard with a singular, fluid motion that defied standard physics. He moved on the exact half-beat of her attack, slipping under the trajectory of her leg. The air rushed past his ear as her kick missed him by a millimeter, before Samantha's foot could even touch the mat to re-establish her balance. Derian's hand moved. It wasn't a strike. It was a grip. His calloused fingers clamped onto the lapel of her rash guard with the crushing force of an industrial vice. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was pity. And for the first time in her life, the billionaire CEO felt genuine, unadulterated terror. Samantha's world tilted sideways. The transition from apex predator to helpless prey happened so fast her brain couldn't process the kinetic math. Derian didn't strike her. Striking required space, and he had instantly eliminated all of it. Using the sheer, unbridled momentum of her own spinning back kick, he executed a flawless kuzushi, the Japanese martial arts concept of unbalancing an opponent. With his right hand locked onto her lapel and his left hand cupping her triceps, he merely pivoted his hips. He didn't throw her. He simply removed the floor from beneath her feet. Samantha went airborne. Her equilibrium completely shattered. Time seemed to dilate as she saw the ceiling lights blur. Before panic could even register, she hit the tatami mat. The impact was thunderous, echoing through the empty gym like a cannon shot. But amazingly, it didn't hurt. In a fraction of a second, Derian had maintained his grip on her GI, pulling upward just as she landed to absorb the brunt of the kinetic shock. He hadn't just thrown her. He had safely guided her to the ground to ensure her spine didn't shatter. "Get up!" Darnell screamed from the sidelines, his voice cracking in sheer disbelief. "Ms. Mitchell, get up! He tripped you!" Samantha gasped, her lungs struggling to pull in air. She scrambled to her feet, her face flushed crimson with a potent cocktail of embarrassment and absolute rage. She was a billionaire. She was a third-degree black belt. She did not get dumped on her back in 3 seconds by a man who scrubbed urinals for minimum wage. She abandoned her taekwondo stance. If he wanted to grapple, she would drown him. She was a brown belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, accustomed to submitting men twice her size through superior leverage and technique. She lowered her hips, her eyes narrowed into predatory slits, and shot forward for a double-leg takedown. It was a perfect shot. Her level change was lightning fast, her hands wrapping securely around the backs of Derian's knees, her shoulder driving hard into his abdomen. She drove her legs, expecting him to topple backward. Instead, it felt like she had just tackled a reinforced concrete pillar. Derian didn't fall. He didn't even stumble. The moment she made contact, his hips dropped with terrifying, leaden gravity. He sprawled, throwing his legs backward and driving his absolute center of mass directly onto the back of her neck and shoulders. The pressure was immense, crushing her posture instantly, burying her face into the foam mat. Desperation clawed at Samantha's throat. She tried to roll, to scramble to half guard, but Derian flowed over her struggling form like water rushing over jagged rocks. Every time she created an inch of space, he filled it. Every time she posted an arm to escape, he seamlessly stripped her base. He wasn't using strength. He was using a terrifying, intuitive mastery of human biomechanics. Within 10 seconds of her takedown attempt, Samantha found herself flat on her back. Derian had moved into full mount, sitting heavily on her chest, completely neutralizing her hips. He took both of her wrists and pinned them to the mat beside her head. He didn't hit her. He didn't crank a submission. He just held her there, absolutely motionless, staring down at her with those calm, haunting hazel eyes. "Get off her!" Darnell hollered, taking a step onto the mat. "I'll call the cops. Phillips, I swear to God." 2 minutes and 10 seconds, Derian said, his voice carrying effortlessly over Darnell's shouting. He didn't look at the manager. His eyes remained locked on Samantha, who was thrashing wildly beneath him, burning enormous amounts of anaerobic energy to free her arms. "Let me go!" she hissed through gritted teeth, bucking her hips in a desperate bridge. Derian rode the bridge effortlessly, staying glued to her chest, his weight perfectly distributed. "You are wasting your energy. Ms. Mitchell, your hips are misaligned, And you are panicking. Breathe. The audacity of the statement, the calm, instructional tone, infuriated her further. But her body was failing her. Lactic acid flooded her muscles. Her grips weakened. She was suffocating under his invisible, crushing pressure. She was completely, utterly trapped. And they both knew it. He could end her life right now, and all her money, her board seats, and her corporate power couldn't buy her a single breath of air. Slowly, the thrashing stopped. Samantha lay pinned beneath the janitor, her chest heaving, sweat stinging her eyes. She looked up at him, truly looking at him for the first time. She saw the absolute stillness in his face, the absence of ego. He wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't gloating. He was simply existing in a realm of violence she had only ever played dress-up in. 1 minute left, Derian stated softly. He released her wrists. He didn't just let go. He stood up completely, turning his back on her and walking calmly to the center of the mat. He reset his stance, dropping his hands to his sides, offering her a free reset. He was giving her back her dignity. But in doing so, he was asserting a dominance so absolute it left her speechless. Samantha pushed herself up to her knees. Her arms were trembling. Her perfectly braided hair was fraying around her face. She looked at the digital timer on the wall. 0:45, 0:44. She didn't stand up. The fight was over. The illusion of her invincibility had been permanently shattered. The harsh buzz of the digital timer echoed through apex combatives, signaling the end of the 3 minutes. To Samantha, it sounded like a funeral toll for her pride. Derian exhaled a slow, controlled breath. He rolled his shoulders once, the terrifying, kinetic tension draining from his muscles as quickly as it had arrived. He walked over to the edge of the mat, picked up his faded gray socks, and quietly began pulling them on over his bruised feet. The gym was engulfed in a deafening silence. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic hissing of Chloe's nebulizer machine from the break room down the hall. Darnell stood frozen at the edge of the mats, his jaw hanging completely slack. He looked from Samantha, who was still kneeling on the tatami, breathing heavily, to Derian, who was currently buttoning up his frayed blue janitorial shirt, as if he hadn't just dismantled a highly trained athlete without breaking a sweat. "What?" Darnell stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Derian. "What kind of cheap trick was that? You grabbed her gi. That's illegal in a striking match." "It was an MMA sparring challenge." Darnell, Brad, the 22-year-old amateur fighter, spoke up. He had been leaning against the heavy bags, clutching his ribs. But now he was standing completely straight. He was staring at Derian with a mixture of profound shock and deep reverence. Brad stepped forward, ignoring the throbbing pain in his side, and walked directly onto the mat. He didn't look at Samantha or Darnell. He walked right up to Derian, stopping a respectful few feet away. "I thought I recognized your base," Brad said, his voice hushed, almost awestruck. "When you sprawled on her, the way you dropped your hips. My old coach used to make us watch tape on you. He called it the concrete sprawl." Derian paused, his fingers lingering on the top button of his uniform. He didn't make eye contact with the young fighter. "You're mistaken, kid. I just mopped the floors." "No," Brad insisted, stepping closer. "You hid the cauliflower ear pretty well under that mop of hair. But I see it now. And the scar on your collarbone. You got that from a titanium plate after the silver fight in Brazil, didn't you?" Samantha, having finally gathered the strength to stand, walked slowly toward the two men, her bare feet dragged slightly on the mat. "What are you talking about, Brad? Who is he?" Brad looked at his billionaire boss, pointing an unsteady hand at the janitor. "Ms. Mitchell, That's Derian Phillips. Derian the Ghost Phillips. Darnell scoffed loudly. The Ghost? What is this? A comic book. He was the undisputed middleweight champion of the world. Brad continued, ignoring the manager, his eyes wide with disbelief. Undefeated in 22 professional fights, he cleared out the entire division across 2 different global promotions. 6 years ago, he was offered the biggest pay-per-view contract in the history of the sport to unify the belts. And then, he just vanished, walked away the week before the contract signing. Nobody knew where he went. Samantha felt a cold chill wash over her skin. She looked at Derian, the faded uniform, the heavy utility belt, the exhaustion in his eyes. The pieces rapidly snapped together in her brilliant, analytical mind, forming a picture that made her feel incredibly small. He wasn't an arrogant amateur. He was a living legend. "Is it true?" Samantha asked, her voice uncharacteristically soft, stripped of its boardroom venom. Derian picked up his utility belt and clipped it back around his waist. He picked up his spray bottle and his rag. The terrifying apex predator was gone, replaced once again by the weary, broken father. "I have a daughter," Derian said, finally looking Samantha directly in the eye. "Her name is Chloe. She was born with severe respiratory and autoimmune issues. My wife, Sarah, was her primary caregiver. When Sarah died of a brain aneurysm 3 years ago, I became Chloe's only lifeline." The gym was dead silent as Derian spoke. Even Darnell had stopped breathing. "Professional fighting requires you to be selfish," Derian continued, his voice perfectly steady, though a deep well of sorrow lay beneath the words. "It requires 6-week training camps in isolation, constant travel, and the very real risk of traumatic brain injury or permanent physical disability. If I get knocked out, if I tear a retina or shatter a knee, I can't carry my daughter up the stairs when she can't breathe. I can't stay awake for 48 hours straight monitoring her oxygen levels." He looked down at his calloused, taped hands. "The glory wasn't worth her life. So I buried the fighter. I needed a job with night shifts so I could be with her during the day, and I needed standard corporate health insurance. Apex combatives provided both." He looked back up at Samantha. "I survived 3 minutes. Ms. Mitchell, I believe we had an agreement." Samantha stood completely paralyzed. For the last 10 years, she had measured the worth of a human being by their bank account, their job title, and their leverage in a negotiation. She had looked at the man holding a mop and seen nothing but a disposable, pathetic stepping stone. But looking at Derian Phillips now, she realized she was in the presence of a strength she could scarcely comprehend. It wasn't the strength to inflict violence, though he possessed that in terrifying abundance. It was the absolute, unyielding strength required to walk away from global fame and millions of dollars to clean toilets in the middle of the night, all to keep a little girl breathing. A profound, sickening wave of shame washed over the billionaire CEO. "The money," Derian prompted gently. $50,000. "Yes," Samantha whispered, snapping out of her trance. She turned and walked hurriedly toward her gym bag resting on a bench near the mirrors. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out a sleek, leather-bound checkbook and a fountain pen. She hastily scribbled out the date, the name, Derian Phillips, and the amount. But as she wrote the numbers, a different calculation was running through her head. $50,000 was a temporary fix. It was a band-aid on a bullet wound for a man dealing with chronic medical expenses. She tore the check from the book and walked back to the edge of the mat, holding it out to him. Derian reached out and took it. He glanced at the numbers, and for a fleeting moment, the stoic mask cracked. His shoulders dropped an inch, and a heavy, ragged sigh escaped his lips. It was the sound of a man who had been drowning for 3 years, finally breaking the surface to gasp for air. "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell," Derian said quietly, folding the check and sliding it into his breast pocket. "I will finish cleaning the locker rooms now." "Wait," Samantha said, stepping forward. Derian stopped, turning to face her, his guard instantly returning. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes," Samantha said, her icy blue eyes locking onto his. "There is a massive problem, and we are going to fix it." Samantha Mitchell did not become a billionaire by ignoring the harsh realities of the world. She built her empire by identifying systemic failures and ruthlessly excising them. Right now, the most glaring systemic failure in the room was standing near the edge of the tatami mat, looking smugly indignant. "Darnell," Samantha said, her voice dropping 10 degrees. "Pack your office. You are terminated, effective immediately." Darnell's jaw dropped. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a pale, panicked sheen of sweat. "Ms. Mitchell? Terminated? But I run this facility. I increased the elite membership by 15% this quarter. You can't fire me over a misunderstanding with a janitor. I am firing you because you are a liability." "Darnell," Samantha corrected, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "You allowed an uninsured, off-the-books employee to step onto the mats for a full-contact sparring session with the owner of the company. If he had broken my neck, which he could have done at any given second, Mitchell Enterprises would be facing a crisis that would tank our stock overnight. Furthermore, your management style is abhorrent. You mistake cruelty for authority. Leave your keys on the front desk. If you are still in this building in 10 minutes, I will have security physically throw you through the front glass doors." Darnell opened his mouth to argue, but the absolute zero temperature in Samantha's eyes silenced him. He looked at Brad, who immediately looked away, and then at Derian, who was impassively adjusting his utility belt, snarling under his breath. Darnell turned on his heel and stormed toward the executive offices. Samantha took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her rash guard. She grabbed a towel, draped it over her shoulders, and turned her attention back to the man who had just dismantled her entire worldview. "Derian," Samantha said, stepping off the mat. "The $50,000 will clear your immediate debt, but it doesn't fix the underlying issue. You said you took this job for the health insurance. Mitchell Enterprises owns this facility. Which tier of our corporate healthcare plan are you on?" Derian hesitated. "The standard maintenance tier, ma'am. Mitchell Basic Care." Samantha felt a sudden, sharp twist in her gut. 6 months ago, during a brutal quarterly earnings review, her CFO had recommended a cost-cutting measure for all subsidiary maintenance and support staff. They had slashed the comprehensive coverage, replacing it with a high-deductible, bare-bones plan. Samantha had signed the authorization without reading past the projected savings on the spreadsheet. It was just numbers to her, collateral damage in the pursuit of profit margins. "The basic care plan," Samantha repeated, her voice uncharacteristically hollow. "It doesn't cover specialized pediatric respiratory therapy, does it?" "No, ma'am," Derian replied, his hazel eyes completely devoid of accusation, which somehow made it worse. "It covers basic emergency room visits and generic albuterol inhalers. The biologic infusions and the pulmonary specialist Chloe needs are out of network. That's where the debt came from." Samantha closed her eyes. The weight of her own corporate ruthlessness crashed down on her. She had been standing in her glass tower, arbitrarily dictating the survival odds of a little girl she had never met, all while the girl's father scrubbed her floors to pay off a debt she had indirectly caused. "Show her to me," Samantha commanded softly. "Take me to your daughter. Derian's protective instincts flared. His posture instantly stiffened, his shoulders squaring up. With respect, Ms. Mitchell, she is asleep, and she doesn't need to be paraded in front of executives. I am not an executive right now, Derian, Samantha pleaded, and for the first time in her adult life, she meant it. I am the woman who just realized she broke the system you are trying to survive in. Please. Reluctantly. Derian nodded. He led the way down the dimly lit hallway, past the heavy bags and the weight racks, toward the frosted glass of the employee break room. He pushed the door open gently. The room smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach. On a dilapidated faux leather sofa, bundled in a worn fleece blanket, lay Chloe. She was incredibly small for a 7-year-old, her pale skin stark against the dark vinyl of the couch. The pediatric nebulizer mask covered her nose and mouth, a thin stream of white vapor escaping with every shallow, rattling breath. Beside her, a frayed stuffed rabbit was clutched tightly in her fragile, sleeping fingers. Samantha stood in the doorway, staring at the little girl. The sterile, cold environment of the break room was a horrifying place for a sick child to spend her nights. A lump formed in Samantha's throat, a foreign, uncomfortable sensation she usually suppressed with anger or action. She has an autoimmune condition that triggers severe asthma attacks, Derian whispered, standing guard by the armrest of the sofa. When the air quality dips, or she catches a mild cold, her airways inflame. Without the biologic infusions, her lungs are slowly scarring. The doctor says she needs to be in a controlled, sterile environment, not a gym break room. Why didn't you go to the press? Samantha asked, her voice barely a breath. You were Derian Phillips, the ghost. You could have done a single interview, set up a charity fund, and the MMA community would have paid for her treatments overnight. Derian reached down, gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from Chloe's forehead. Because the MMA community doesn't just send money, Ms. Mitchell, they demand access. They would want cameras in her hospital room. They would want to plaster her face on pay-per-view broadcasts for a sob story narrative. They would turn her suffering into content. My wife and I promised we would protect her from that life. I'd rather scrub toilets in the dark than sell my daughter's privacy for a paycheck. Samantha looked at the man. He was battered, exhausted, and pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance. Yet, his integrity remained entirely unbroken. He was a king, wearing a janitor's uniform. I need to make a phone call, Samantha said, stepping back out into the hallway. 10 minutes later, Samantha returned to the hallway outside the break room. She had changed back into her bespoke charcoal suit, the armor of her corporate life, but the predatory edge that usually accompanied it was gone. She held 2 cups of terrible break room coffee, handing one to Derian as he stepped out, quietly clicking the door shut behind him. Thank you, Derian said, accepting the styrofoam cup. Don't thank me yet, Samantha replied, leaning back against the cinder block wall. I just got off the phone with the chief administrator at the Mitchell Medical Pavilion. It's our private research hospital across town. I've authorized an immediate transfer for Chloe into their pediatric pulmonary wing. Derian frowned, shaking his head. Ms. Mitchell, I can't accept that. I told you. I won't take charity. The $50,000 you gave me was earned on the mat. I won't be a project for you to assuage your corporate guilt. It's not charity, Derian. It's a signing bonus, Samantha countered smoothly, her brilliant business mind rapidly constructing a solution. I don't just own this gym. I own a conglomerate that is currently expanding into overseas markets. My personal security detail is a joke. They are former cops who think wearing sunglasses and looking intimidating is enough. After tonight, I realize how profoundly vulnerable I am. And beyond that, I need a striking coach who won't coddle me because I sign their paychecks. Derian took a sip of the bitter coffee, his eyes narrowing defensively. I am not a bodyguard, and I retired from coaching. You are a father who needs a miracle, and I am a billionaire who needs the best. Samantha fired back, stepping into his personal space, refusing to let him retreat into his shell. Here is the offer. You take over as the Director of Executive Protection and Combative Conditioning for Mitchell Enterprises. You will personally oversee my security protocol, and you will train me privately 3 mornings a week. Your starting salary will be $400,000 a year. Derian stared at her, genuinely taken aback. That's absurd. Let me finish, Samantha continued, her eyes locked onto his. More importantly, you will be bumped to the Mitchell Executive Platinum Healthcare tier. It covers 100% of all medical expenses, in-network or out, experimental treatments, private rooms, and world-class specialists. No deductibles, no questions asked. Chloe gets the absolute best care the modern medical world can provide. Starting tomorrow morning, the mention of the healthcare tier hit Derian like a physical blow. $400,000 a year was life-changing money. But the platinum healthcare was a literal lifeline. It was the cure. It was the end of the sleepless nights, the panic over medical bills, the fear of watching his daughter slowly suffocate. What's the catch? Derian asked, his voice thick with emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. The catch is that you work for me, Samantha said, her tone softening. And I demand excellence. Furthermore, I will draft an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Your identity as the ghost remains completely sealed. To the world, you are simply Derian Phillips, Corporate Security Director. No press, no cameras, no MMA spotlight. Chloe's privacy remains absolute. Derian looked at the frosted glass of the break room door. He could hear the faint, steady hiss of the nebulizer. He thought about the exhausted years behind him and the terrifying, uncertain years ahead. He looked back at the billionaire standing in front of him, a woman who, just an hour ago, he had assumed was nothing more than an arrogant tyrant. She was offering him the one thing his fists could never win in a cage, a guaranteed future for his child. Slowly, Derian reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded $50,000 check, and held it out to her. I don't need this, Derian said quietly. Draw up the contract. I'll take the job. Samantha didn't take the check. Instead, she pushed his hand back. Keep it. Consider it a hazard pay advance for having to deal with my ego on the mats. Tomorrow at 8 a.m. My personal driver will be here to pick you and Chloe up. We go to the hospital first. Then we go to headquarters to sign the paperwork. For the first time in 3 years, a genuine, unforced smile touched the corners of Derian's mouth. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed his entire face. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. It's Samantha, she corrected, offering her hand. Derian shook it. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely devoid of the lethal pressure it had possessed on the tatami. The deal was struck in the quiet shadows of the gym hallway, a pact between 2 radically different worlds. But while a new future was being built inside Apex Combatives, a toxic fire was being lit outside in the cold night air. Darnell Lawson stood in the rain-slicked parking lot, clutching a cardboard box full of his desk belongings. He was shivering, entirely consumed by a venomous, humiliating rage. He had built this gym's reputation. He had catered to Samantha Mitchell's every whim, and he had been discarded like trash, all because of a mop-pushing fraud. Darnell pulled his smartphone from his pocket. His hands were shaking as he scrolled through his contacts, finally stopping on a name. Greg Reynolds, MMA Insider. Greg was a notoriously sleazy sports journalist. He ran a massive tabloid website that specialized in leaked fight camp footage, personal scandals, and destroying fighters' reputations for clicks. He paid top dollar for exclusive dirt. Darnell hit the call button. The line rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Reynolds, make it quick. It's late." "Greg, it's Darnell Lawson from Apex Combatives." Darnell sneered, wiping the rain from his face. "I've got a scoop that's going to break your website in half, but I want 50 grand for the exclusive." 50 grand? You're out of your mind. Darnell, go to sleep." "Wait!" Darnell barked, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "What if I told you I know exactly where Derian the Ghost Phillips has been hiding for the last 6 years? And what if I told you I have security footage of him taking down Samantha Mitchell, the Billionaire CEO, on my mats tonight?" The line went dead silent for a long 5 seconds. When Greg spoke again, all the fatigue was gone from his voice. It was replaced by the predatory hunger of a journalist who just struck gold. "I'm listening," Greg whispered. "Tell me everything." Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private suite at the Mitchell Medical Pavilion. For the first time in her life, Chloe was resting in a bed that looked more like a luxury hotel than a clinical ward. The air in the room was heavily purified, and instead of a rattling, makeshift nebulizer, a silent, state-of-the-art oxygen delivery system hummed gently in the background. Derian stood by the window, holding a cup of high-end espresso. He barely tasted. He had slept for perhaps 2 hours on the plush sofa, unable to fully shut off his protective instincts, but watching his daughter sleep peacefully without the constant, terrifying wheeze in her chest felt like waking up from a 3-year nightmare. The heavy, crushing weight on his chest had vanished. The door to the suite clicked open, and Samantha stepped inside. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored navy suit, but her usual unshakable composure was fractured. She held a sleek tablet in her hand, her knuckles white from how tightly she was gripping the device. "Derian," Samantha said, her voice tight and urgent. She closed the heavy acoustic door behind her, locking it. "We have a massive problem." Derian's combat instincts flared instantly. He set the coffee down, stepping between Samantha and Chloe's bed, his posture rigid. "Is it her treatment? Did the doctors find something else?" "No. Chloe is fine. Her medical team is the best in the world," Samantha reassured him quickly, though her icy blue eyes were entirely devoid of relief. She held up the tablet. "It's Darnell. He stole the localized security footage from the gym servers before he turned in his keys last night. He sold it to a tabloid journalist named Greg Reynolds." Derian felt the blood drain from his face. "Sold what? Exactly?" Samantha tapped the screen and turned it toward him. On the glaring display was the homepage of the Raw Canvas, a notorious, high-traffic MMA gossip site. The massive, glaring headline read, "The Ghost Secrets Revealed, Undefeated Champion Caught on Tape Assaulting Billionaire CEO." Beneath the sensationalist headline was a crystal-clear, high-definition video ripped directly from the Apex Combative security cameras. It showed the entire 3-minute sparring session. It showed Derian utterly dismantling Samantha, pinning her to the mat, and the ensuing conversation. But worse than the video was the accompanying article. "They have everything," Samantha said, her voice shaking with residual anger. "Darnell told them your real name. He told them about your wife passing away. He told them you were hiding out as a janitor. And Derian, he told them about Chloe." The silence in the hospital room became deafening. Derian stared at the screen, watching his worst fear materialize in digital ink. For 3 years, he had sacrificed his pride, his career, and his passion to keep his daughter insulated from the vicious, consuming eye of the public. Now, Her private medical struggles were being monetized for clicks. "How many people have seen this?" Derian asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, hollow register. "The video went live at 4 a.m., Samantha replied grimly. Reynolds aggressively pushed it to all major social platforms using paid syndication. It currently has 8 million views. And it's climbing by the second. The mainstream sports networks are already picking it up." Before Derian could respond, a low, collective roar echoed from the streets below. He stepped to the window and looked down. Gathered at the front entrance of the Mitchell Medical Pavilion were dozens of news vans, paparazzi with long-lens cameras, and chaotic crowds of eager fans holding up cell phones. They had tracked down the hospital affiliation through Darnell's leaked information. They were swarming the gates, screaming Derian's ring name. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Derian's chest. He turned around, rapidly scanning the room, his eyes frantic. He grabbed his faded canvas duffel bag from the chair and began shoving his few belongings into it. "I have to get her out of here," Derian muttered rapidly, his breath hitching. "I can carry her down the service elevator. We can take a cab to the bus station. If we leave the state, I can find a new clinic." "Derian, stop!" Samantha commanded, stepping directly into his path. "Move! Samantha!" Derian barked, the terrifying intensity of the fighter bleeding through his carefully constructed calm. "You don't understand these people. They will camp outside her door. They will point cameras in her face while she's struggling to breathe. They will turn my daughter into a reality show tragedy. I will not let that happen. And I will not let you run away," Samantha fired back, refusing to flinch or step aside. She reached out, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Look at me. You are not a janitor anymore. Derian, you are the director of security for Mitchell Enterprises. You are under my protection now." Derian stopped pulling away, his chest heaving, his hazel eyes wide with a desperate, fatherly terror. "You stepped onto my mat and fought my fight," Samantha said, her voice dropping into the cold, ruthless cadence of the boardroom predator she truly was. "You used your leverage to humble me. Now, you are going to let me step into my arena, and you are going to watch me use my leverage to destroy them." Derian stared at her, seeing the absolute, uncompromising certainty in her eyes. Once something is on the internet, you can't just take it down. The damage is done. You clearly have no idea what a billionaire can do when she is genuinely motivated, Samantha sneered, though the malice wasn't directed at him. She pulled a sleek encrypted smartphone from her jacket pocket. "Stay in this room. Order room service. Do not turn on the television. Give me exactly 4 hours." Samantha strode into the executive war room of Mitchell Enterprises headquarters, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floors. Her entire legal team, public relations division, and cybersecurity heads were already assembled around the massive mahogany table, looking terrified. "Status report," Samantha demanded, throwing her tablet onto the table. "Ms. Mitchell," her lead corporate litigator started nervously. "The footage is everywhere. Claiming copyright infringement is a slow process, and fair use protections. I didn't ask for a lecture on copyright law." "Richard," Samantha cut him off, her eyes blazing. "I want the head of the snake." "Who owns the raw canvas?" A junior analyst quickly typed on his laptop. "It's a subsidiary of Vanguard Media Holdings, ma'am. They own about 30 digital tabloid and sports blogs." Samantha smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant expression. "Vanguard Media. They rely heavily on syndicated ad revenue and server hosting, correct? Call our tech division. Mitchell Global provides the cloud hosting infrastructure for Vanguard Media." The room collectively gasped as they realized what she was doing. Kill their servers, Samantha ordered. Pull the plug on their entire digital network. Cite a critical breach of terms of service regarding the distribution of stolen corporate data. But Ms. Mitchell, that will take all 30 of their websites offline. They'll lose millions in ad revenue by the hour, the tech director protested. They will sue us into oblivion. Let them try, Samantha scoffed. Call the CEO of Vanguard. Tell him his servers remain dead until Greg Reynolds is fired. The article is permanently scrubbed from the internet, and a full, legally binding retraction is issued stating the video was deep-faked. Deep-faked, Richard blinked. But we know it's real. It's real to us, to the public. It becomes a malicious AI fabrication, designed to damage my company's stock. Samantha dictated flawlessly. Next, Darnell Lawson. He stole proprietary security footage from our private, encrypted servers. That elevates this from a petty leak to corporate espionage and grand larceny. Richard, I want you to call the district attorney. I want Darnell arrested before lunch. I want his bank accounts frozen pending a civil suit for damages. I want him absolutely ruined. The sheer violence of her corporate strategy was awe-inspiring. Samantha was applying the exact same principles Derian had used on the mat, controlling the center of gravity, applying crushing pressure, and suffocating her opponent's ability to breathe. Within 2 hours, Vanguard Media Holdings capitulated, facing millions in immediate losses and a terrifying legal war with a billionaire conglomerate. They fired Greg Reynolds, deleted the raw Canvas homepage entirely, and issued a groveling public statement claiming the footage was an unverified, artificially generated hoax. Simultaneously, local authorities, heavily pressured by Mitchell Enterprises' legal muscle, raided Darnell Lawson's apartment. He was dragged out in handcuffs, sobbing and bewildered, charged with felony data theft and extortion. By 2:00 p.m., the news cycle had completely pivoted. The aggressive legal takedown and the deep fake narrative provided just enough doubt to kill the viral momentum. The paparazzi outside the hospital, realizing the story was rapidly becoming a legal landmine, packed up their vans and dispersed to chase easier prey. The ghost had been successfully buried once more. That afternoon, Samantha returned to the hospital suite. The chaotic noise of the morning was entirely gone. Derian was sitting in a comfortable armchair, reading a storybook to Chloe, who was sitting up in bed, looking more vibrant and energetic than she had in years. Derian looked up as Samantha entered. He saw the relaxed set of her shoulders, the absence of the media circus outside, and he understood. He carefully closed the book, kissed Chloe on the forehead, and stepped out into the hallway with Samantha. "It's done," Samantha said quietly. "Darnell is in custody facing 5 to 10 years for corporate espionage. Reynolds is permanently blacklisted from sports journalism. Vanguard Media issued a full retraction claiming the video was a hoax. The mob has moved on." Derian stood in the quiet, sterile hallway, absorbing the magnitude of what she had accomplished. She hadn't just protected his daughter, she had waged a war to secure their peace. He had spent his entire life relying solely on his own fists, his own endurance. For the first time, someone else had stepped into the ring for him. "I don't know how to repay you," Derian said, his voice thick with profound gratitude. "You don't owe me anything, Derian," Samantha smiled gently. Her icy demeanor completely melted away. "But I do expect you at the gym tomorrow at 6:18 a.m. sharp. My defense clearly needs work, and as my new director of security, you can't have your boss getting thrown around." Derian laughed, a real, deep, resonant sound. 6 a.m., boss. Bring your gloves." 6 months later, the cavernous expanse of apex combatives echoed with a different kind of energy. The sun was just rising, casting a warm golden hue across the pristine tatami mats. Samantha Mitchell, wearing fresh hand wraps and a focused, determined expression, threw a lightning-fast combination at the heavy mitts. Derian caught the strikes effortlessly, calling out adjustments, his voice commanding and clear. He wore a crisp black athletic uniform bearing the Mitchell Executive Security crest. The heavy lines of exhaustion on his face had completely faded, replaced by a calm, purposeful strength. Behind the frosted glass of the break room, the space had been completely transformed into a vibrant, sterile playroom. Chloe sat at a small desk, drawing with brightly colored markers, breathing easily, her cheeks flushed with healthy color. Derian lowered the mitts, nodding approvingly at Samantha's improved footwork. They stood in the center of the mat, no longer divided by class, wealth, or ego, but united by mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it truly meant to fight for the things that matter. The ghost had finally found his home, and the billionaire had finally found her humanity. Did this incredible story of redemption, sacrifice, and justice leave you absolutely speechless? Derian's journey from a broken, exhausted single father to a highly respected protector proves that true strength isn't just about winning fights. It's about the lengths a parent will go to for their child. If you were captivated by this intense clash of worlds between the ultimate martial arts master and the billionaire CEO, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this inspiring story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, dramatic, and heartwarming real-life stories every single week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Derian's shoes?